too many people are cynical and they need to like realize, hey, it's super easy to sit in your house smoking weed, drinking beer, saying everything sucks. That's wicked easy. That's the easiest thing you can do. To show up and get involved in the party. I mean, I go to these meetings and it's all people over the age of 60, and I get it, it's boring, and they need to, fix that. But young people got to give back. You got to show up and vote, and you got to show up for, whatever kind of events you can that you see happening and sort of change the narrative.
You're listening to Granite Goodness, the podcast where we interview New Hampshire people making the world a better place.
Oh, Susie, where are you going now?
My name is Andy DeMeo. This episode was sponsored by and recorded in Treeline Outfitters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Today, I'm talking to John Kuiper. John is running to be the Democratic nominee for governor of New Hampshire. He also owns Johnny Boston's International Restaurant in Newmarket. We talk about how to build more housing, how running a campaign is like running a restaurant, hating paperwork, campaigning as an outsider, campaign finance, and a ton of other stuff on this episode of Granite Goodness. John Kuiper, welcome to Granite Goodness.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming. I'm so excited to have you on the show. I've been a patron of your restaurant for a long time, it feels like. I lived in Newmarket for 4 years, and I'm a proselytizer of the chicken burrito bowl. It's the best thing. I've taken that thing home. I've dissected it. Like, I've taken it apart and, wanted to know what's in it, the secret sauce. And that's what we're here to talk about today. But yeah, I can't believe you're here. Like, you are such an interesting guy, doing a lot of interesting stuff. And this is a New Hampshire-oriented show, and you're like Mr. New Hampshire right now.
That's flattering. Thank you.
So we always try and start. Tell me a little bit about like your New Hampshire credentials, so to speak.
I'd love to. So my family moved here. We first lived in Merrimack when I was first born. And my dad was a nuclear engineer in Seabrook. So that's why we moved here. My mom's family's from Massachusetts. So we lived in Merrimack for a little bit and then moved to Stratham, where I pretty much grew up. And went to public school. I say that because I went to Exeter High School and frequently...
they think you went to the academy.
People be like, oh, did you go to the academy? Like, no, we were the public school kids. We were the kids that were getting in fights with the kids in the academy. Not really, but
harassing them for their uniforms.
Harassing them, yeah.
Too organized.
Yeah. So I'm pretty New Hampshire through and through. After high school, I went and traveled for a while, lived in Australia for a bit, and went to school there, and then came back. And when I got back, my parents had moved from Stratham to Durham, so I stayed with them there for a little bit. Ended up living in Newmarket for a bit. Back then, this was like in 2004, 5. And then ended up living in different parts of the Seacoast area for a while, and then ended up back in Newmarket in 2010.
Was that before? There was some big like Main Street project in Newmarket,
That was in 2007,
right?
I believe, where they buried the power lines and widened the sidewalks.
Yeah.
So Newmarket's really had a bit of a transformation over the last 15 or 20 years. When I was in high school in Exeter, Newmarket was basically... So Newmarket's 50% rentals. Really important to understand. So there was always apartments there.
Wow.
So Newmarket was generally where you would go to live if you got your girlfriend pregnant in high school. You know what I mean? That's where they would always end up living. It's like Newmarket.
There's one place for you if you're on that track.
Yeah.
But you're going to be
literally,
okay.
up until 1998, and maybe even later than that, there was still a cable company in the mills producing cable. And I vaguely... This is the mills in Newmarket.
Wow.
And I vaguely remember driving through Newmarket and seeing a guy out there in the union suit, smoking a cigarette or whatever. Like, it was still fully functioning. And then around the 2000s, the mills completely closed. And there was a really bad decade where the mills were closed. There's all these, smashed out windows and stuff.
Yeah.
And then Chimberg came in and made an offer to redo the mills in 2010-ish. And so that was really kind of the renaissance for the town. And so I opened my restaurant in 2014, like right after the mills had been finished.
Yeah.
So we kind of rode in on those sort of coattails. And it was really funny because in 2010, I moved to Newmarket. I was working at Riverworks. And, there was only Riverworks. The tavern was a little kind of dive bar restaurant. And then a pizza joint, or a couple pizza joints, Chinese restaurant.
Are you referring to Geppetto's Pizzeria?
There's Geppetto's, there's Panzanella's, and there's Jeremy's.
Yeah.
That was basically
yeah.
it, And so 5 restaurants more or less, and now there's probably about 12.
Right.
So it's quite a transformation, and it's kind of funny because running for governor and on the campaign trail, so many people have lived in Newmarket because its proximity to UNH that it's a real asset. Because there's a lot of places I could live that are random towns that no one would know about.
Yeah.
But everyone knows about Newmarket. And enough people have been back there that they know that it's transformed. Mm-hmm. And it's been a really helpful sort of an idea of like, hey, what if all of New Hampshire was rejuvenated the way Newmarket was?
Yeah.
And wouldn't that be a nice sort of template for a lot of our little towns and cities that are struggling?
I lived there for 4 years after college. It was, true to the demographic. My first apartment that I paid for, like after school as an adult, was in Newmarket. It was right across from you, actually. There's a blue building. It's a little crooked.
Yeah.
There used to be like a pet kind of grooming salon in there. Yeah, the apartment right above that with the big bay window. This really nice lady, owned part of that building and would rent out the 2-bedroom for, she gave it to us for $750 a month. So it's the perfect first apartment for my girlfriend and I. And, you were right across the street, Johnny Boston's. And
what year was that? $750 for rent?
I think even that was under market at the time, but that would have been August of 2017.
Yeah.
When that.
So not even that long ago, really, in perspective.
No. And now, even now I know it's like gotten crazier. And, then we moved up the street to Spring Street, right on the corner of Spring Street. There's a house with those 4 weird poles sticking out of it. I lived there, and half of that house was in a unit, and we paid $1,700 for the whole thing, and that was a 3-bedroom.
Yeah,
and that was a nice apartment, and I know that the rent has like gone up, $500 or $1,000 even since then, and that would have been in like 2019. So it's even in the time that like I, as a youngish adult, have lived there and moved away. My friends who are still there, some of them are getting priced out, and the Newmarket, and it's all cyclical, right? Like the Newmarket I knew is not the Newmarket that was, is not the Newmarket that you knew, and like it's exactly as you say. I feel like there is a whole, it a little bit is a microcosm of the whole state, maybe, right? In terms of like what's happened to it, the gentrification, but what's good about the development, what's tough about it. You could do a whole episode about Newmarket.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great little town. It's definitely where. So I opened my restaurant in 2015, and it was from there that I kind of got propelled into this idea of running for governor, because it was funny. Actually, in 2015 was the first year when I was looking at the Secretary of State's website, and I realized I was qualified to run for governor, being that I was 30. I'd lived in the state for 7 years, and I was a registered voter.
That's it.
So I was like, huh. And from that day, when I read that, like my list of grievances with the state, if you will, sort of grew longer and longer as I had to deal with them as a business owner, and then, as a resident, and then as a parent. And, And I was on a bunch of boards in town, ZBA, Energy Environment Committee, and the town council, and there was just all these things that were happening in the state that seemed like, just literally seemed and still seems like there's no one at the helm, that the governor doesn't have a lot of authority. He's considered a weak governor, and almost a caretaker position where you don't have a lot of authority. Just make sure the checks for the plow drivers go out, and the parks get the trash.
A rubber stamp.
And that nothing was your fault, and there was nothing you could do about anything, and it was just sort of troubling to see that the two big issues that kind of became apparent was, one, there was not enough housing being built, and two, New Hampshire and Newmarket were aging as older people moving in, young people moving out. And I just knew enough about demographics even a few years ago to know that that was not a sustainable
Yeah.
course, that you just need a mix of age groups. You need young people to take care of old people.
Right.
And that you need a tax base, and
Right.
if everyone's retired on a fixed income, it's just not good for the economy. So
Right.
that was where I sort of got to this point in the last year or so where it was either attempt some sort of change or give up
Yeah.
and move to Maine.
Right, right.
And so I was like, I was looking at houses in Maine for about 2 or 3 years and property in Maine. And I thought, before I exit this state that I love and have lived in my entire life, I think I will at least go on like an airing of my grievances tour.
That's right.
And it's been kind of funny because the message has resonated enough with people that it went from being sort of this like, oh, I'll just put some videos up on social media, to being where I had a campaign manager who found me out and was like, I want to help you, and have been able to make an impact to some degree, at least, on the conversations and the way what the other candidates are talking about, and then also. It's been cool. I've been able to give speeches in front of hundreds of people at some of the Democratic fundraisers. The Shaheen McIntyre dinner, which has got all of our senators there, all of congressional representatives. Governor from I think it was Wisconsin or Michigan. Nope, not Michigan. I think it was Wisconsin.
I was going to say it was Gretchen Whitmer.
Yeah, it was not her. It was another guy. I should probably remember his name, but. And I did a bunch of these type of events. So the fact that I was able to just sort of like bullshit my way onto a stage,
Sure,
where it was like Chris Pappas, John Kuiper, Maggie Hassan, Gene Sheen. You know what I mean? In the
one
same
of these
lineup.
is not like the other.
Yeah,
and
the best part was I got up there and basically was like, hey, Democrats got to stop preaching to the choir. We got to get young people excited to vote. We got to reach out and get people that aren't Democrats, working class people, back in the fold by offering them some really like tangible plans for making the state of New Hampshire cheaper to live in and better to live in. And it was really funny because I got off the stage that first event and a couple of guys came over to me and they were like, this one guy just came out, like patted me on the back and said, give him hell, Johnny. And then like a couple other guys were like, dude, you're the only one that actually said anything.
Yeah.
Like the rest of them just sort of like want to crap on Republicans and sort of like crap on Sununu. And like, that's not really a strategy to like increase voter turnout.
Right. Big tent, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, there is so much to love there. And you touched on this. I think that your framing of your place in the race for governor is very compelling, right? I saw in an interview you said, and you touched on it just now, you may have to move if something doesn't change, that you'll literally be priced out of the state. And, you said, as it stands now, you want to have more kids even, and that you feel like you don't have enough space. Like it's deeply personal. And, my question is like, and you've said as much as, does that resonate with people? Do you find yourself on the campaign trail, kind of upending this, I don't know, general cultural sense that like public servants, they don't have skin in the game, that they're not, people of the people or men of the people, right? Like,
yeah, I think that's been kind of the most resonating aspect of it. It's just that, as many people have said, like, wouldn't it be nice to have one of us? You know, somebody else said, it'd be nice to vote for someone that wasn't part of the oligarchy.
Sure.
Somebody said that the other day, and I laughed, but I mean, it's true. The idea that only we have this, we've kind of brainwashed ourselves, where the ruling elite has as well, to this idea that the only people qualified to be governors and whatever are, politically connected. They have to be wealthy. Probably should be a lawyer. Maybe should be a lobbyist.
Yeah.
And then we look at the outcomes we've gotten over the last decades for predominantly putting our leadership in the hands of lobbyists and lawyers, and it's like they're not great at running a state.
Sure.
They're good at being lawyers and lobbyists, but when it comes to actually like making long-term decisions that might be in their short-term, not in their short-term political interest, they're incapable of doing that.
Right.
And the story of New Hampshire is just a story of kicking the can down the road with education funding, with housing, with opioid, the opioid addiction disaster. It's just everyone's thinking about 2 years ahead, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's where, I mean, I was just talking to the folks from the Sierra Club, trying to get their endorsement. And I said, this is the difference between me and the other people that are running for governor. If I could, for instance, and I don't know that I'm going to do this, but I'm happy to say it. If I was to, let's say, declare a housing emergency and declare a global warming, global climate change emergency, and say, we need to do these things, and I'm going to permit housing that's getting denied by towns and cities. I'm going to send out the National Guard to put solar panels on the rooftops of every school and every municipal building in the state, right?
Sure.
And it's going to piss off the voters so much that they're going to not elect me for a second term.
Right.
So be it. If I could get 50,000 units, approved and get a bunch of, get us farther down the mark on climate change in terms of mitigating that and getting ready for that, I don't care, because it's not to me about creating a political career. It's about creating results,
Right.
And I mean, I think one thing, and I just feel like a lot of New Hampshire politicians just are afraid to make that sacrifice. But when they were planning, when they're voting on Obamacare, back whatever was that 2010, I think 2009, 2010 when they were debating it. There was people that were there who knew if they voted for this, they would lose their next election. And I have a lot of respect for those people, and they did it, and they lost, and I've heard interviews with them now, and they said I would do it exactly the same way because I knew that we needed a change to how we funded healthcare. We needed this, and that's the kind of politician I hope to be, is someone that's willing to do what has to be done, regardless of whatever kind of career I'm trying to make out of it.
The electoral consequences of that, or public opinion even, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see more politicians saying, hey, I'm going to get in there for this one goal, and when that goal is completed, I'm going to not run anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Get in for your issue and then get out. This idea that people need to be in there for decades of their lives, I feel like is not really helpful.
Right. We're a democracy, on paper and in practice in a ton of ways, and you can have a legitimate debate to which what parts of the system are more or less democratic or accessible and whatnot. But, in theory, what everyone I think is supposed to kind of agree on is it works better when all, constituent groups, all demographics are represented, right, and have a say, and there's something to be said when that's not the case, and I think it's an interesting discussion to have of someone on the outside of there's a lot of talk right now in the political world of, there's the appeal of outsiders, right? Trump is framed as an outsider and all these people. And, there is a sense among a lot of Americans, a lot of voters that, the status quo, kind of run of the mill thing, they feel as though it hasn't delivered results for them, whether you believe that's true or not, you can quibble with that, but that's the attitude, right? That, a lot of our elected officials, they don't, like you said, they don't have skin in the game and they don't care and they're too detached. And, what's the right balance of being an outsider looking in on kind of political office and saying, if I could get in there, I could do better and change anything. And then you get in there. And then how do you decide, when do you become part of the machine?
Yeah.
Is that something, because you've had this interesting thing of just not just being you've had political consciousness for a long time, obviously, right? You're an engaged citizen, you're an entrepreneur, business owner, family guy, you lived your whole life here. But tell me about that, being more politically engaged, meeting some of these people who we might see as more insider actors, right, who've been in their office for a couple of years, the dynamic between insider outsider. What have you learned on your journey about that?
I think it really comes down to pragmatism versus idealism.
Yeah,
where it's really easy to be idealistic on the outside and then get in there and find the when you see how the sausage is made, it's a lot more terrifying and,
right.
and a lot more complicated, and there's so much more nuance, and there's so much more potential for downstream negative effects to something that you might have thought would be a positive thing.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets tricky, and where, it does help to have people that are in there that know how to navigate that machine.
Right.
You know, and that's where like my campaign manager has been a state rep for 10 years.
Yeah.
And she will be following me, you know, to Concord when we win. And will be helping me navigate that and help work with legislatures to write legislation that is going to be good for the people of New Hampshire. And I mean, part of the left or the Democrats' problem is that they suck at messaging and they're not good at messaging. And when they do win, you know, sometimes the Democrats will get these wins, like for instance, you know, the infrastructure bill that they passed. It's going to have a lot of green energy, you know, money in it. A lot of that's not going to be. You're not going to see that for years,
right?
You know, way past Biden, and so, and I mean, it's kind of like, it's almost like the Democrats crossed a bear. Is that we're constantly getting sort of punished for the short term,
right,
and never rewarded for like the long term, you know, gains that we made,
yeah,
and that we're like kind of keeping things stable, whereas the Republicans are sort of like playing this pretend game of like fiscal responsibility when they do not care about that at all.
Right.
When it comes to cutting taxes on the wealthy, or you know, funding wars in foreign countries, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, like so that's definitely, it's an interesting idea, and I had you know, I'd kind of wondered, you know, because it really comes down to who's financing your campaign, right? And up till now, it's been self-financed. I put in a little bit of money, and then whatever money we've gotten from people. You know, our biggest donation has been $1,000. Was one of our friends, and so I kind of had wondered about. Well, this is actually an interesting story along those lines. I won't say what industry it was, but this guy came into the restaurant. I'd known him for a while, and he said, "Hey, I work in this industry. We sell this widget." And I'm like, "All right." And he said, "Hey, just so you know, New Hampshire is one of the only states that doesn't tax this widget." I was like, "Oh, cool, I didn't know that." And he was like, my industry, because he imports this and stuff, he said, my industry heavily donated to the former governor's campaigns to ensure that we did not have a tax on this widget.
Yeah.
And he said, perhaps if I talk to my people, we can have a fundraiser for you, and we can, you know, as long as you agree to not tax this widget.
That's the sausage, John.
And that's it. And it was kind of funny because I ended up reaching out to him because this was a widget that I don't think really anyone thinks about that much, and it's not really that big of a deal.
I bet it was a K truck, wasn't it? One of the Japanese K trucks.
Right?
Yeah.
But the funny thing was, and like we ended up, I never talked to him again. He might have looked at my platform and gotten freaked out. But I realized that's the game. You know what I mean? And this was probably going to be a little fundraiser that he wanted to throw me, and I'd make, I don't know, $1,000 or a couple thousand. But that's the game. That's what all these other people are saying. And when you look at the millions of dollars that my competitors have raised, you realize they're not free to do what they want when they get in there. And it's crazy because they celebrate this. You know, they'll say, "Oh, record-breaking fundraising. We just broke a record. You know, we raised $1 million, $2 million, $3 million." It's like you're just advertising that you are even more bought and sold. You know, you are just like, this is like announcing, "Look how much I sold out.
Yeah,
I sold out $3 million. I sold out $4 million." Like, at that point, you can't make any decisions on your own without consulting a bunch of unions and a bunch of other, industries and a bunch of rich people who do not want taxes on them. They do not want regulation on their industry. They don't want anything to change, you know?
Yeah.
And that's just one thing I would love for people to come away with this, with this idea in their heads that, you know, the way that we fund the elections is obviously wrong. And I've had it in my head, you know, because it occurred to me. I had hoped, you know, when we first started, I thought, oh, we'll get, you know, we'll make all our money selling T-shirts or something, or we'll get 1 million people to give us $5. You know?
Yeah,
It's never happened. Or some rich person will come along who won't require me to, you know, say I won't tax them or regulate their industry, and they'll give me money or whatever. You know, that hasn't happened. Probably for better than worse, but it's just. So I've had this idea like, hey, the way to get money out of politics is to do politics with no money. You know, try to do this and we have all these free assets now through social media.
Yeah.
Where, you know, I can run a bunch of social media videos out there and hit a whole demographic that putting ads on WMUR or on TV is not going to see. None of these people even have TV anymore.
Right.
You know, and So I think we have an opportunity to do politics with no money. We'll see. I mean, this is sort of the experiment that I'm running.
Yeah.
And it might come out. Nope, you can't.
Right.
Which presents a whole new problem, you know, because I have sort of been at least acting with the pretense that we are still in a democracy in which anyone can like succeed. And I will say, I did not think that when I got into this thing, I thought the Democratic Party of New Hampshire would like not want anything to do with me.
Sure.
You know, I thought, and I was told from other people like, hey, you're not going to have any chance to do anything with them.
Yeah.
And the complete opposite was true. They've invited me into all these events. Partly that was because of my campaign manager. And I think that I was a bit of a novelty to them and just kind of
right.
They keep me around. But I mean, that was a huge help to the campaign, just like being able to speak at these events and participate and gain some traction from there and just feel, you know, some validity on my end of it. So it's definitely possible to participate, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But is it possible to win?
Right. Is
like the next level. And we'll see, you know, we'll see.
Yeah. No, it is a very interesting problem to contemplate, you know. Another guest on our show, the mayor of Portsmouth, he was on, and even he commented, you know, that you had an impact. You know, we brought you up, and he said, oh, yeah, you know, John Kuiper, he's out there, and he has really helped push, you know, the conversation towards housing, right?
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so, you know, even, like, regardless of, you know, even, like, your party, like, or what your political interests are, like, there is an awareness on a personal level from me, right? Talking to somebody who is a little bit more part of like the political machinery, right, than yourself, he had an awareness that, oh, this guy is out there and is, you know, pushing the conversation.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is a fun journey to hear you talk about and contemplate of like what began perhaps as the last gasp, you know, revenge tour, airing of grievances. You know, it's like, well, actually, maybe it's picking up a little steam.
Well,
you know?
This has been kind of the most hilarious part of this mission has been that. So it was partially was my airing of grievances, but the real like flint or the real like, you know, light of the fuse was when I read an article in the Daily Beast in July, I think, of last year that said that one of the people running for governor, Cindy Wormington, had been a lobbyist for Purdue Pharma. And I read this article. She's a lobbyist for Purdue Pharma. They have her on video saying OxyContin is not habit forming and totally safe. And I have got enough dead friends and dead acquaintances that I know that that's a lie. And I know that anyone who made money off of Purdue Pharma will never be elected governor of New Hampshire. This is just fact. You know, I just know that. I've talked to a bunch of people about it. It's pretty well known. So I assumed she was going to drop out. Then when I found out she wasn't going to drop out, I was like, over my dead body is this woman going to be governor of New Hampshire? So that was a big part of it. But the funny part was I got into it and a bunch of people were like, well, you can't just make your entire campaign around, you know,
grievance.
Or just complaining about her because no one's going to take you seriously. And also it's just not the done thing. You know, like we try to keep the party positive and you don't want to be the one going after because it'll turn off her supporters if you do win. And I mean, not that I really thought I would anyway, but I was like, all right, well, we'll be strategic about this. I'm not just going to come out of the gate saying it. And I did make some videos before I had a campaign manager where I just was basically like totally annihilating her campaign. But so it was kind of funny because I sort of left it on the back burner. And then, but then the more I talked to people that were insiders, I realized I almost didn't even need to make it as big of a deal because it was going to be a big deal eventually. And everyone outside of her supporters and her campaign knew that there was no way that she was going to win or is going to win. And not going, that's real true. But the funny part was that after that, I thought, okay, well, Joyce Craig, who's the other person I'm running against, she's the mayor of Manchester. Like, she's got this in the bag, you know, biggest city in the state. Like, obviously, she's going to win. And then what happened is shortly after that, I think this was in March, if I'm thinking it right, Joyce Craig was not running for mayor again. She was running for governor. And so she endorsed a guy named Kevin Kavanaugh. He then lost the mayoral race to another guy named Jay Ruiz. And immediately I was like, ooh, I think this is really bad for Joyce Craig because it means the unaffiliated independent voters of Manchester are not happy with Democratic rule in Manchester. And if they're not happy with Democratic management of Manchester, why would they vote for her for governor, you know? And all of a sudden, I was like talking to people and they were like, you know, these candidates are both really boring. They're both very similar and they're both not super popular outside of like the immediate Democratic circles that they live in. And this is where I realized how just completely myopic the Democratic Party of New Hampshire is.
Sure.
And a bunch of them live in Manchester, so they don't leave Manchester. They think Manchester is just like the capital of the state, not realizing that everyone that lives outside of Manchester, like if we're going out, we go to Portsmouth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Right.
people in Manchester even go out in Portsmouth.
Yeah.
You know, not a lot of people from Portsmouth go out in Manchester.
Yeah.
You know, we go to maybe SNHU to see a stand-up comedy show or something, but that's about it. And so it's been really kind of funny, like learning about these different. And then the thing about Cindy Worthington is she had been a big part of the party for a long time. Her husband's a treasurer of the party. And so people had just told me like, oh, I spent 3 hours in a car ride with her, like on the way to this Democratic event. Like she's a really nice person, blah, blah, blah. And it was so funny. It was so hard for me to say this to them. But I'm like, look, it doesn't matter how you feel about her personally. It's about whether or not she can get elected. And it doesn't matter even how you feel about her work at Purdue Pharma. It's about how the Republicans are going to make that look. And same with Joyce Craig. I'm like, what are the Republicans going to do to Joyce Craig? Like, how are they going to take her on? It's going to be homeless encampments videos. It's going to be, you know, people, crime and drug addiction. Even though, you know, these things have actually improved in the last decade, partially because Joyce Craig was the mayor. It's all about perception is reality. You know, and the average voter, the average independent voter who maybe isn't paying that much attention to Manchester generally is just would not think that that's the direction they want the state to go in.
Yeah.
So it's been kind of funny because I have found myself doing, I think, better than I thought, not because I'm like a brilliant politician or something, but partially because the Democrats and the Republicans have just got these like major flaws in their candidacy, and so it's become like a little bit more real to me, you know.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating because I'm like, man. So they've each spent millions of dollars. You know, they've all spent like $1 million. I spent like $25,000, and I'm like, dude, if I had 10% of their budget as opposed to 3%, I know that I could win. You know, and that's slightly frustrating, but I also sort of think like, that's kind of the point, you know, of this whole thing is like, how far can we go with the smallest money possible? And what does that translate to? And like, you know, like you were saying before, there are goals that, I mean, we're already kind of surpassed some of my goals in terms of just like minor things like, oh, I've never really done a speech in front of even 100 people, not 400 people.
Yeah.
And I did that, you know, and it was great. So like I've sort of made some personal accomplishments that are totally worth this whole wild ride. Met a ton of cool people. Also changed the tenor of the conversation where no one was talking about housing at all. That's been really positive. Now they're like literally stealing my lines, which is fine. It's great. I love it.
The best form of flattery, right? Yeah.
Totally. And like, I mean, one of the things, I went hard on legalizing cannabis, and Cindy hadn't said it publicly. Joyce had not said it either way. Now they're both firmly in the legalization camp, like firmly.
Yeah.
And they're talking about what they're going to do with the money, which was also another issue I had. I'm like, if you talk about more about what we could do with the money for legalizing cannabis, the people that aren't into it, I think will become into it because they're like, oh, we need the revenue. You know, so it's kind of funny because I wish more people would not take the, like, so the thing with governor, and this is, so to run for governor or Senate or Congress in New Hampshire, there's this assumption. And the governor, you need $2 million minimum. You want to run for Senate, it's at least $1 million. You want to run for Congress, probably $2 million. You know, you want to run for state Senate, it's probably $300,000. And they have these numbers that just all the consultants will tell you.
Wow.
This is how much money you got to have, right? And to the point where, like, there's this woman who was running for Congress for Annie Custer's seat, and she's very popular state senator. She hadn't hit her fundraising goals, and she was like, hey, I didn't realize how much money mattered, and like I can't beat these other two people. They have raised way more money than me. I'm going to drop out. And like, I didn't talk to her about it. I didn't really know her, but I wanted to say like, hey, you don't know that. Like, stick at it. Like, who knows? Like, maybe it's not just, and I have to believe it's not just about who can pump the most TV commercials out there, or who
Yeah.
can pump the most junk mail into your mailbox. I have to believe that there's like another way to do it. But it's just so funny how many people like create this obstacle that no one's ever said that. There's no
Right.
rule.
Yeah.
No one's ever tried to not do it.
Right.
And maybe they have and they failed, and that's why we don't know about them. But
Right.
I just think and this wouldn't be even possible in an earlier era, but just because social media and the internet has got all of these ways of getting your message out. We've got stuff going on Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, even I put some stuff on Nextdoor the other day.
Yeah.
Randomly, someone was like, dude, try Nextdoor. And somebody literally messaged like, I'm voting for you. I'm your neighbor. I'm voting for you. Sweet. I'm like, cool.
Right.
And it's like, is that not hopefully? And the other thing, not everyone can pump out the number of social media videos that I do. Maybe
Right.
they could if they really tried, but like I can talk a lot. So I have no problem putting out, 20 videos in a week or whatever, probably more at this point.
Yeah.
And so it's just one of those things where like we're either, on one side it's like a kamikaze mission. Well, it's not kamikaze, but we're on this mission that we're, it's never going to work out. But on the other end, it's like, what if it does?
Yeah.
What if it does?
Right. Well, what's the downside? There is a real opportunity cost, but this is something we talked about even a little bit before, like we turned the mic on, right? But there is such an attitude of winner take all, right?
Yeah.
Or that you are. It's actually kind of sad the way that we talk about. It's weird. Like my feeling is that in America, one of our great strengths culturally is that we celebrate failure in business.
Yeah.
Right? Like we laud entrepreneurs. We're very supportive of, hey, go out, do it, try it, be different. Like this is a very American thing. But in politics, if you lose, it's like excommunicado, like you're persona non grata, you're dead.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, we don't want anything to do with that person. They tried to, run for that seat and they failed.
Yeah.
So they're damaged goods, right? And it's like, it's a very strange, bifurcation, like in the way that we laud pursuit and effort and like journey and all that in one way, but another way, just you're ostracized for trying.
Yeah.
And it should, my opinion, which I'm going to state this is just my opinion. I just try to stay neutral, is that, it feels like a very arbitrary thing. And particularly in politics, which is supposed to be about, expression and debate and solving problems, right? Like it should be the opposite. We should be celebrating every average Joe who wants to get up and say, I ran for governor, I ran for this seat and I got there and I tried and I talked to people. So part of the beauty of, the business world, right, is that you can see all kinds of examples of this across the spectrum, right? And there is this really interesting conversation to be had of like, all right, what, if you're going to talk about business, right, you need to talk about capital and like it's human beings, it's intellectual property, it's physical property, right? And like, what's the most efficient way to deploy that to create wealth in ways that, whatever is your goal, if it's we reinvest into the business or, we want to lower the price of a thing or we want to have a new innovation, like there's all kinds of ways you can be motivated by, things you can do in the private sector. But there is an endless and important debate to be had about what is the optimal way to deploy these things, and particularly for public services, right?
Yeah.
Like the government has more money than anybody. You could zero out. I think I saw a thing the other day of assume you could convert, the net worth of all the richest people, like the 100 richest people, into pure cash money, right?
Yeah.
Which like I don't know that you could, but even if you could, I don't know that it would equal like the budget. Like maybe it would fund the United States for like a couple months or something.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like the government and the heft and the sway of these enormous institutions is like there's so much money at play, and I think it's important, as you're saying, to make sure, we're getting the revenue that we need to fund the things that we need to invest in and all that, but it's also just as important to are we getting bang for our buck, right? Like how many high speed rail projects have we watched die because, whether they weren't funded enough, like maybe we never really tried, or they died because of regulatory issues. It's like, other countries figure out, they build high-speed rail all the time, and like Japan and Europe, and it's like, why can't we do that?
Well, it's interesting. So when I was on the town council in Newmarket, the town manager was talking about putting in a train station. He was just he was like, oh, I'm going to see.
Didn't there used to be a train station?
I'm sure there was, yeah. Yeah, there definitely was, yeah.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, maybe we could put in a train station because the town randomly owns some property along the train tracks. And around the same time, Plastow, New Hampshire, was looking into adding a train station. And they did a feasibility study. The feasibility study cost $600,000. And the answer was, it's not feasible. And the thing is, I have been to some pretty poor countries, or countries that you'd say not as affluent as the United States, like Mexico or Vietnam or whatever. They have trains,
Right.
And, like, I don't think they spent $600,000 on a feasibility study. They just poured some concrete and the train stopped.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I think we have in this country, just made everything so complicated. And part of it, honestly, is environmental regulations too.
Yeah.
And it's a way to maintain the status quo by just burying everything in bureaucracy. There's a really interesting article in the New York Times. I don't know if you saw this because I reposted on TikTok about elevators, and basically how in the rest of the world, especially Europe, they build smaller elevators. So these 4 and 5 story apartment buildings will have these small elevators in them. But in the United States, an elevator must be big enough to fit a gurney, so that if someone's having a medical emergency, they can get them out on through the elevator.
Yeah.
So what they end up doing in the U.S. is just not having any elevators.
Oh,
so
sure.
the EMTs are just taking the stairs,
Right.
and just trying to bring the guy down the stairs. Whereas, like, at least if you had a small elevator, they could take the elevator up and carry the guy down the stairs.
Yeah, maybe you could drag him in the elevators.
Yeah, and this
Sorry,
whole article
EMTs listening.
had a lot about just the level of bureaucracy, and it was complicated, but just that we'd made it so hard to build elevators that frequently, and so expensive,
Right.
because of the size requirements and all these other things that they just didn't make them, and so we just had a lot of 4 and 5 story buildings with stairs, or and then other places they wouldn't even build a 4 and 5 story building because the elevator is not worth it. They would just build condos or only 2 or 3 stories.
Right.
So I think what's happened is the United States is a couple hundred years old, and we've had this kind of like continual growth of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That is at the point where it's not sustainable. And I think a lot of us are recognizing that, like, I mean, this is one of my opinions that Republicans love is like, yeah, we need taxes. I don't like paying them. I'd like the government to be as small as possible. The part I want to shrink is like the prison industrial complex.
Sure.
And the military industrial complex, not so much like social services. But at the same time, I think once the government gets too much money, they start doing dumb stuff. You know what I mean? Like, you read about some study that they did, to see if they could increase, sidewalk use, and it was like $1 million. You know what I mean? Like, you read about this
or
in
like
California.
The end of the
lot,
fiscal year is approaching. We need to spend all the money that's
well,
left.
that's
right?
it too.
Yeah.
That whole type of budgeting is, and this is kind of the problem, like between the private and the public sector. And this is the constant give and take. Is like the public sector. When you have a profit, like, yes, it eliminates inefficiencies, but also eventually makes things more expensive. Because you have to pay this profit, and then also you can lead to where they constantly have to increase the profit and increase their growth. So then they start doing bad things, such as like adding cheaper ingredients,
right.
Especially for food. Food's a good example because cheaper ingredients because they have to continue. Like we've created a society because of the stock market that is not okay with just maintaining.
Right.
You can't maintain. You got to be growing. If you're not growing, you're dying. And it's like that's not sustainable on this earth. And with the government, it has the kind of opposite problem where it has to spend everything that's allocated, or else it's punished by not getting more funding. And I don't know exactly what the solution is there, except to say that, like, in some ways, I would like to see New Hampshire particularly have like a 10-year modernization plan.
Yeah.
Where we'd have a committee that would take time, and they're not elected people, and they'd go through each aspect of the government, each department, and this is how I do it. I'd go to the lowest employee and I'd say, hey, what's the dumbest stuff that you do, paperwork-wise or whatever, that you don't want to do anymore?
Yeah.
That has no material benefit for anybody.
Right.
And I'm sure that you would find, because I know this from dealing with the Liquor Commission that these things exist, that we could probably shrink the government a lot by just eliminating, useless
paperwork, pencil pushing.
I'm seriously against paperwork. That's probably like my foundational, political philosophy is that I'm anti-paperwork.
Yeah, well, it's a true thing, of like in theory, every rule is introduced for a good reason.
Yes.
For somebody at some point in time, right? But
yeah,
there is a very human bias to like when we're confronting a problem to add something, right?
Yeah.
Of like, oh, this is broken. Let's add a step so that it doesn't break again. And when really, if you do that, as you said, 20 years, then you have no living citizen could possibly comprehend the full scope of the law.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we should change the law to have it be like a pocketbook or whatever, but there is a point where I think a reasonable person looks at it and say, gosh, you mean to tell me we can't build, a train or, a solar panel or this or that because the environmental impact assessment alone is going to take 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. Or this would be a great segue into housing, right? Tell me how wrong this is. I mean, this is just my impression, that for housing, people tend to either say, we need the government to make people build more affordable housing, or they say, government needs to get out of the way so people can build more, increase supply, and bring the price down. Are those both true? Is one more true? Like,
definitely.
what's your opinion?
So the problem is we put off building housing for so long because we've allowed basically these, I would say, anti-democratic planning and zoning boards to have, I would say, disproportionate power. I do not believe the founders of this country intended for any abutter on a property to say that that property, within reason, can't, the owner of that property can't do what they want. So, like one thing that absolutely drives me crazy is with housing is that someone's a renter, right? And their landlord, this is happening a lot right now. Landlord will come to them and say, hey, the market rate for your apartment's actually $1,700. You're only paying $1,500, so I got to put it up $200. And they say, oh, it's not my fault, it's the market, right?
Right.
This same renter can't buy an acre of land and say, the market dictates that I put 20 apartments on here. Because the neighbors around here are going to say no. So it's not free market capitalism at all.
Right.
But what ends up happening is when the government intervenes in the market, the only way to prop up society in these other ways is, okay, we need more state-funded housing through the housing authorities. Or, oh, this person's can't afford the rent. We need Section 8. Oh, this person, their rent's so high. Now they need food stamps. You know what I mean? And it's like, this dawned on me a couple months ago that it's like the more government intervention we get, the more we're going to need. And we're going to have to keep propping up and propping up and propping it up. And if we just allowed the free market to operate, even for a limited time, let's say like 10 years, or even until, and this is where I'm a big fan of, is metrics. Okay, so we say, within reason, we're going to be housing positive in terms of we're going to try to make every housing development that gets brought to us, even if we don't like it, we're going to try to get it through for the next 10 years or until the average person is paying less than 30% of their income towards rent or mortgage, And then, but the problem is that we put it off so long and we encourage everyone to go to college instead of the trades. So now building's expensive because the materials are more expensive and the labor is more expensive and the land is more expensive than it was, say, 20 years ago if we had if we'd been building the right amount of properties every year. So now we're going to need some government intervention and some freeing up of the free market. I don't think either one will be enough.
Right.
So this is where I came out with this idea to legalize cannabis, sell it the same way we sell liquor, and put the profits into housing. And initially I was thinking just the New Hampshire Housing Authority, and their main job is like they help finance big apartment buildings, and they'll help people with the first-time home buyers, down payments. I think maybe another potential way we could do it is take this money, it should be hopefully about $100 million from cannabis, put it into a bank account, and basically say, all right, this is like, and this might actually be the best way to do it because cannabis is still federally illegal. If we created the authority, it would be like the New Hampshire Cannabis and Housing Authority. So the money comes into them, and they're getting all the money from cannabis, and it doesn't even go to the general fund or even to the state at all.
Yeah.
Their job is to loan this money that they just got out in the form of low interest loans to developers who are going to make the exact type of housing that we need, which is like small starter homes, tiny homes in people's backyards, mixed use, density. That's really what, like, if we want our fields and our farmland open and our forests, which I do, we have to be willing to make, more compact housing in downtown areas where it would make sense. I heard from somebody just saying that, like, we basically just stopped building neighborhoods, to some extent. And it's a really funny thing because, like right now in near town, one of my town nearby, somebody wants to put in basically a 4-story building of apartments, and people are freaking out because everybody freaks out, with any change to their downtown, but they just do not really seem to understand that, it's not happening in a vacuum. There's all of these downstream effects by not having housing. And so I thought of this idea the other night, which people will probably hate that own homes and who object to building. But I think basically, if you are saying to someone that they can't build an apartment on this acre of land or whatever, you have to give them an acre of land to do it somewhere else.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
That should be the only way that you can object.
Yeah.
Within reason. I mean, especially particularly when housing and the type of housing that we need. Like, if it's the housing that we need, it's not McMansions, it's affordable, like rents, apartments, reasonable rents. And if you're a neighbor and you say, I don't want them to do that, all right, you buy me whatever, an acre of land somewhere else. Tell me where I can do it.
Right.
If not here, where?
Yeah.
Where? Like, I'm just like, it's so easy to come up with reasons to block housing, be it parking or environmental issues, or we don't have a wastewater treatment plant, as opposed to like finding ways to say yes and say like, all right, for instance, like there's a big issue where, if you need 2 parking spaces for each apartment, I mean, this huge parking lot out here. I was thinking the other day, is there some way a developer could say, hey, I'm going to put money, invest in this bus system, and we're going to put a bus station here, a bus stop here. And maybe people are going to park, somewhere outside of this area, and that's where their cars live. I mean, a whole other thing that's going to happen again, going back to artificial intelligence, is when all the cars are run by robots and they don't need a place to park. They can go, or they don't need to park where you are. They're in some industrial area somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of these things, the problem is that people just don't understand that they do not live in a vacuum, that there's things happening. And I mean, the bottom line is the leading cause of inflation is housing.
Yeah.
If you want your prices to come down in New Hampshire, we've got to build more housing. Right. And if you're saying, hey, not in downtown or not in this area, well, then where? If we're not going to develop downtown, then where? Like, it just, it's people have this quaint idea that we can just not grow. And the problem is this, and it's heartbreaking in some ways, because what's happening is a lot of the people who grew up here and who maybe either left and came back or never left do not make enough money to buy a house in New Hampshire. So who does? People that live in Massachusetts and work in Massachusetts, and they're coming up here in droves, right? So if you keep this up, right now over 50% of graduating high school seniors leave the state. A lot of times because they go to college somewhere else because they can't afford college in New Hampshire.
Right.
But if you keep this up for a couple of decades, you're going to end up with a state where no one is from here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And the older people who are staying, who are from here, are going to find that they can't stay either because their taxes are going to get too high. Their cost of healthcare is going to get too high because the nurses and LNAs, they left already.
Yeah.
So like we're going to end up with this thing where we worship at the
altar.
The altar of local control
Yeah.
to such an extent that nothing else seems to matter.
Right.
All that matters is that this town is able to do whatever it wants for housing, no matter what.
Yeah.
And it's like, if we all act like this, it's no one's going to be able to live here. Like it's so myopic and it's so short term, and it's just something that I think we either are going to solve, or I mean, it's going to solve itself one way or the other. I mean, people are going to leave, and then there's going to be housing here eventually. The baby boomers eventually are going to retire, and the question is, can they retire in this state, or are they going to have to leave? And then are we going to just am I going to move to Maine for 10 years and then buy inherit my parents' house? Like, probably. At the rate things are going. That's probably like a more realistic long-term plan is for me to just leave the state for a decade or so and then come back once the housing market comes back down because the boomers have left. So, I mean, I don't think that's a great plan.
Yeah.
But it's just a conversation that I think people need to be a lot more realistic about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like you got at something really great that I'm just going to come on and say I like. Well, it is part of some of what we try and promote on this show is, the non-zero sum kind of worldview, right?
Yeah.
There is this stereotype that I think is fair and accurate among a lot of American homeowners, right? If they say, oh, wonderful, I'm happy I was able to buy a home and the community around me, I want it to stay exactly the way it is the day I bought it, right? And it's like, okay, but you were able to move here.
Yeah.
What if someone else wants to move here, right? And there's a very legitimate conversation to be had about, how much, it's going to sound controversial, but how much democracy, right, and at what level is optimal, right, to solve these big problems, right?
Well, the local control thing I think is really important to look at, because if you look at who's on these planning and zoning boards, it's generally homeowners, right?
Yeah.
And 95% of the legislature is also homeowners, whereas in reality, about 30% of the state is renters. And renters, and it's sort of, some of the blame goes in the backs of renters in the sense that they're moving so often, particularly every couple of years, they don't necessarily have roots in the town where they are at. And frequently I meet people who may have been in a town for 10 years, but will say, I never intended to be here that long, but it just happened. So they never got involved in the local planning and zoning.
How could they represent it, right?
Yeah, and what happens is you end up with sort of the homeowners protecting their home value, which is not the plan, was not the intention of planning and zoning laws, and to defend sort of their class of people being upper middle class people, not having to be around anyone potentially poor. And what ends up happening is you basically have those of us in the apartment class. I mean, I own my building, but I live in an apartment.
Yeah.
We are sort of at the tyranny of the homeowners, who have in some ways more power. And what happens is if somebody is advocating, like let's say someone wants to build a workforce, building with, 50 units for affordable rent, or even not affordable, but market rate rent, you have homeowners near that will come and object, but you don't have any theoretical renters who are showing up and saying, hey, I would not be homeless if this apartment was built.
Right.
And that's the disconnect, is there's not a lot of advocating happening for the future homeowner or future renter.
Right.
I mean, there is organizations doing it, but it's not it's not even really fair.
Yeah, that's not
it's
the
an
same
imbalance
level.
of power.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, really, it's just, it's not a great way to do things, because what happens on the local level is that people don't want to make any hard choices. You don't want to say that this apartment building is going to go in because your buddy Jim lives right there and you're going to see him at the softball barbecue and you don't want to have to deal with him being mad at you. So even if 100% that we need more housing and it's going to affect inflation and homelessness and all these things, it's like, easier to say no.
Yeah. Right. There are many problems socially and, politically that we're comfortable kind of outsourcing or giving responsibility to higher governmental levels, right?
Yeah.
Like it would seem crazy to, the average person to say, let's allow each locality or community or town in the United States or any country, right, to be responsible for defense, national defense spending,
That's a good point. That's
right?
a good
Like
point.
that would seem crazy, right? Like, how would you do it?
And why do we allow this one actually massive thing, such as like urban and rural planning, to be basically chiseled out town by town? I mean, the crazy thing about New Hampshire too is that the way that our government is structured is the towns and cities only have the powers that are granted to them by the state government. So in other states, it's different, where the towns have any powers that haven't been explicitly not given to them.
Like
I guess.
the 10th Amendment thing.
Yeah, there's and I can't remember exactly what it's just like our system of government means that like the towns only and the municipalities only have whatever powers the state gives them, and any of those powers can be removed at any time.
Right.
So the state can always supersede any decision made by a town.
Sure.
Within reason. Like,
Yeah.
not everyone, but there's ways of going about it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny because the people on the state level sort of are like, oh, well, we don't want to mess with the local control, and the people on the local level are like, well, we're going to just drive this, Titanic right into the into the iceberg, because it's in our self-interest. So that's really where, I mean, I am hopeful that with education, a lot of the people in the planning and zoning boards would change their mind. And it's becoming one of those issues where it's easy to be against housing. It's easy at first, but then as time goes by, there's more and more people that you see affected by it.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen in the next coming couple of years? 50% of baby boomers do not have enough money to retire. And 50% of baby boomers, or no, 80% or something, it's crazy, a really high number, live in houses that they cannot retire in because of the location of the laundry or the bathrooms or whatever.
Yeah.
And so we need a bunch of like smaller condos and townhouses and stuff for these baby boomers to downsize into that are like small and affordable and like on the first floor, that sort of thing, or have elevators or whatever. And so I think the baby boomers, who I think are generally, not exclusively, but are a big driver of the NIMBYism, are going to find their friends and maybe themselves are going to be the victims of this lack of housing.
Yeah.
So I think it's, to some extent, I mean, it's kind of like with gay marriage. I think what happened was enough people suddenly realized that they knew gay people,
right,
and that they should be allowed to be married.
Yeah.
That it became like, oh, geez, I forget. I didn't know Jim was gay. Like,
right.
That's fine with me. Like the guy at work, whatever. It became enough, like in society, that it was tolerated or not tolerated, but was legalized, like gay marriage.
Demystified.
Yeah,
right?
demystified. I think the same thing is going to happen with this sort of lack of housing and the downstream effects. You're going to start seeing. I mean, already we're seeing. Some restaurants closing, some hospitals are struggling. There's daycares that are closing because they cannot find enough staff, and all of these issues just really fall back on housing.
Yeah. Or even, I mean, you must know, I personally know people who became homeless or unhoused or whatever the preferred term is, I mean, everybody knows someone who, I mean, do you know anybody who's like, man, I love my rent.
Yeah.
I love it. I think it's at the appropriate price and all that. But
it's totally true.
It's silly. I like that you mentioned NIMBY, right? For the layperson, define NIMBY for us.
Not in my backyard. It's an acronym.
And you would say, are you a YIMBY?
I would say I am. I'm a YIMBY, and it's really to me, it's really just a matter of doing what's right for all of society and not being selfish and not being just really narrow-minded, and realizing that the problems aren't just going to be homeless encampments, but like I said, it's inflation, it's price of goods, it's just quality of life. I've been hanging out in Manchester a lot, and because they do not have a real good solution for the homeless people that are there, they keep pushing them around from one park to another. They have all these extraneous effects, like they can't have, they don't have a lot of public restrooms. You can't barbecue in the park. Like
right.
You can't do all of these things that are now affecting everybody's sort of quality of life.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to find a solution for literally like 50 people.
Yeah.
Like it's not a lot of people. I was hanging out in Veterans Park. I was talking to one of the guys that lives there. 15 people live in that park.
Wow.
I'm like, surely there's an empty building around here that we could build 15 very small, single room occupant style apartments where there'd be a communal kitchen or whatever, and you guys could at least be out of here. And the thing about it is, like, most of them are disabled or veterans, which means they're entitled to a paycheck.
Sure.
But the paycheck they're entitled to is maybe only $1,000 a month. So it's not like we're talking about free housing.
Right.
It would just be, based on their income, and it would be no barrier. If like someone's disabled and had lived through the trauma of the Vietnam War or something and wants to get drunk every day, let them. In my opinion,
right?
And again, pretty soon, this whole discussion about like, oh my God, we're gonna give them free houses. It's just gonna be so, is gonna be so much more in people's faces with going back to artificial intelligence and the robots taking people's jobs, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be less of like, oh my God, I can't believe we're just going to like pay for their housing, where it's going to be like, wow, if we don't, 1/3 of the state is going to be homeless. Like, how's that going to work?
Sure.
So that's where I kind of look at like dealing with housing and homelessness as like the precursor to what's coming up,
Yeah.
And if we can't deal with the idea of some sort of state subsidized housing now, it's only going to be worse in the future when all this goes down.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm kind of like, if we can't deal with we have a huge homelessness problem, but when you really look at it, it's probably about 1,000 people that are like physically sleeping on the street. There's a lot of people that are in between, and we need to help them too. But like, it's not like it's 10,000.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's
Right.
1,000. Like
Yeah.
it should be scattered around the state. There should be ways for us to get these people housed, if in a medium or immediate way, just state sanctioned camping.
Yeah.
You know, with porta potties and dumpsters and tents, so that at least then the outreach workers know where to get them.
Right.
You know, and then from there it's like, all right, tiny homes is probably the next level. And it's like, to me, it's just like kind of playing the game of Sim City. You know, you start out with this little house, then you make it bigger. And it's like, how do we get them to a point where they can potentially start working or start trying to get sober or start trying to deal with some of their like trauma that they've endured from 10 years of living on the street.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I had a really interesting experience happen the other day where we'd met some homeless guys and we were chatting with them, and we went back to sort of check on them, see how things were going since that Supreme Court, case. And it seemed like they were fine. Like they had figured out they weren't really getting harassed by the police more, which I was surprised about. But it was so funny because we're sitting there. It's like 5 or 6 guys, no, maybe like 10. And, it was like evening, so they definitely had a few drinks for sure. And this guy had his speaker going, and Wonderwall came on, right, by Oasis. And all of a sudden, like, I'm talking to this guy, and all of a sudden, like, 7 of them are all like singing along to Wonderwall. And and like all of them are just doing it. And I was like, and they were like having a moment, and I was like, dude, these guys are probably living like a more fulfilling, like communal life. It's probably rough, rugged, and harsh, and all that stuff. But like, they they probably have this sing along like multiple times a day.
There's community there.
Yeah,
in
and that's what happens to a lot of them. They get pulled out of that community. They go into like housing that's not the same, and they're alienated or they feel alone. And so it's a really interesting, I think, study in just like, is the nuclear family living in a house alone, is that the right way to live? Or is maybe these guys living in a group of tents is actually closer to the way that humanities have lived for thousands of years? We're actually the anomalies, and they're the ones that are doing what our ancestors have done for so long, getting a bunch of tents together and keeping away the wolves.
Right.
So I just think it's worth thinking about why we think that what they're doing is so wrong.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And the fact that we can't even like find ways of tolerating it in a functional way.
I've heard this said that the great strength of humans is, we can tolerate pretty much anything, but that's also a weakness, because you can suffer.
You learn to tolerate.
Right.
Yeah.
You learn to tolerate. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
I'm with you, on this idea of I think the world would be a better place if generally we were more, pro experiment, let's encourage people to try different things, different living situations, different housing structures, or, buildings and this and that. Like this whole thing only works, and the parts of it that only work well are because, we get wisdom from the collective, and the collective of like people doing different stuff, having different experiences from you. We got to channel that collective wisdom efficiently, into the structures around us. And, politics feels particularly divisive right now, to a lot of people. I don't think that's controversial to say. You're running as a Democrat, but as governor, you would be governor of everyone, not just the Democrats. Tell me about that. Is that something you think about a lot?
Totally. So I think it's worth noting that I had thought about running as an independent because, frankly, I was tired of the Democrats losing. As much as I aligned with their views, I was tired of them losing, and I was worried that they were so hell bent on losing that I would just be losing with them.
Yeah.
And I was talked out of it because of just all the reasons.
Right.
And I'm glad I didn't, because they have actually. I thought they would exclude me. I did not think they would welcome me. That was completely wrong about it. They have totally welcomed me in. It's been very helpful, but it's definitely interesting because I have found that most of the Republicans that I talk to that aren't MAGA, full-on Trumpers, are basically have the same issues as all of us. It's inflation, it's housing, it's price of the grocery store. It's it's the same sort of issues. Very few people bring up the very divisive things, that we seem to be obsessed over, or that I think the extremes of both parties like to make the whole conversation into. And it's interesting. I had somebody come up to me, a Democrat who's elected state rep, and she said, "Hey," she was younger, under 40. She was with a Republican. She's a Republican with a younger Republican. She said, "Hey, just so you know, like the younger Republicans, we want to vote for you. We don't want to vote for the Republicans that are running for governor."
Interesting.
And she said, "I would be an independent if that was actually a lane, but it's not." And she said, I'm a Republican, but I'm anti-war. I'm pro-cannabis, pro-housing. And the housing thing particularly is really not that partisan as much as it is whether or not you own a house.
Sure.
Or whether or not you know someone who's struggling with housing. That's kind of the divide. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to run as an independent. Is I was like, I'm finding as many NIMBY Democrats as there are Republicans, and some of them are worse because they think that they're like somehow better than the Republicans and then also are blocking housing. And I'm like, I don't see how you can be a Democrat.
It's all the same to a homeless person.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so, and for all the reasons that we're all frustrated, I had thought long and hard about that. And I have basically learned how to communicate with Republicans because of, decades of work in the hospitality business. You have to learn how to, especially being the owner of my own restaurant. Like I can talk to Republicans and I can find our common ground, even with hardcore Trumpers, they'll tell me some stuff I didn't know about him in terms of like Paul. Like I had a guy a couple nights ago who was telling me just some policy stuff that I can't remember specifics, but he was basically saying, here's some things that the Democrats wanted done. Trump did it and they won't give him credit for it.
Sure.
Like he had kind of Trump had initiated the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obviously he didn't do it, what happened under Biden, but that was just kind of one example. And I definitely think that I'd say people under the age of 45 are really tired of partisanship, and that the future is going to be a lot brighter. I think that basically we've learned the lessons of the Biden, Trump years, and that this like ultra partisanship is not good for anybody, and it's where everyone's sick of it.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to say that Republicans seem to be sick of it too, and I think everyone's ready for return to normalcy.
Right.
And that I hope, as governor, I will be able to be a governor for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think I will. I had a lot of Republicans just say that I'm speaking common sense, which just not a lot of politicians from either side are doing enough of right now. And just being honest and being genuinely who I am, on the campaign trail has been really, I think, cutting through a lot of the BS to the point where people don't care as much.
Yeah.
It is tough. There are a couple of really polarizing issues, and I've sort of found ways to deal with that. honestly, the things Republicans, I sort of said this earlier, but they just want to hear that, I don't enjoy paying taxes. And if in an ideal world, I wouldn't,
Right.
But I understand we need clean water and roads and schools. And so I participate because that's, taxation is the cost of participating in a civilized society.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, we're coming to some common ground about taxation and just the fact that the state needs money and what's the best way to do it. And relying so heavily on property taxes is really not a great long-term solution because it just makes that one tax so high.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty optimistic about the future. I think that once this coming election is gone, I think it's good that Biden's stepping down because I know a lot of people just didn't want to vote for someone over this age of 70 or 80 or whatever.
Sure.
And I hope that the people reward the Democrats for that, for being able to get him out of there.
Yeah.
I will see, Trump's definitely doing really much better in the polls right now, but I think that would be good because if it's Kamala or one of these other sort of like, I feel like they're just not super divisive, and they're not, obviously everyone's got some negatives in their column, but they're not the same way that like, I think people looked at Biden as being the opposite of Trump, and now like they don't have that anymore. So I'm hoping that people just, in terms of not electing a geriatric, because of this idea that we need younger people, will look at her or whoever it is and presume it's going to be someone under the age of 80, and vote for them versus the older person. Because I think just the reality is that I think as people under the age of 50 need to recognize that the older generations really struggle with long-term planning. I think
Sure.
that's not controversial. They have not done it well over the last 20 years. And I do not see a world in which they're going to suddenly wake up and creating a more sustainable future for our children. So that's where I think it's important that we elect young people, bottom line. And it's really fun right now. I'm really hoping I win the primary because right now we have a ton of young people running for executive council, running for Senate, running for state rep. And we could make a really cool mailer for the Democratic Party code in New Hampshire. That would be like 30 people under the age of 45, and if I win the primary, it'd be me included.
Yeah.
And we can say, hey, we're like the new generation. Like we're here to, make a state that works for everybody. I think that would be really powerful. And that's kind of the argument I'm trying to make is that, a lot of the baby boomers get it. They do. They understand that their time is up, and it's time to pass on the baton.
Yeah.
Enjoy your retirement. Go take care of your grandchildren. Do whatever you wanted to do. Like you guys carried us through to here, and we did not have a nuclear war through the entire Cold War. That's amazing. There.
That was a good thing.
Good job. Yeah. Like you didn't cause a nuclear war,
right.
and now we've got some things we got to deal with, and it's going to require a new type of thinking. And I think most people understand that aspect. And I mean, I do not understand, Biden's clinging to power. Like, who wants to spend the last 3 or 4 years of your life just like worried about the entire world? Like, I couldn't think of anything like that I would least want to do than be on my deathbed, like having to make these decisions. And not only that, but they're going to accelerate your aging for sure. So I think that I think we're basically at a generational shift that was going to happen anyway.
Yeah. And
the sooner that we recognize that as people under the age of 45 or 50 and realize that we need to like take the reins of power, and show up and vote, I think we will be able to craft a much better future for ourselves. But, at the end of the day, it comes back to people getting involved and showing up. The parties, this is one thing we learned from Trump, and I wish the Democrats, the progressives, young progressives would realize this. The MAGA and Trump took over and reinvented the Republican Party from the ground up. I mean, they have almost none of the same beliefs that they had 10 years ago.
Right.
Fiscal responsibility is out the window. It's all about cutting taxes regardless of what happens. All these things are gone. And the progressive Democrats, we could do the same exact thing, but we've got to show up. We got to show up and be coordinated and be smart. I mean, frankly, the Republicans and the conservatives have been better coordinated. They've been smarter, and they've had goals that they have spent decades on, abortion being the big one. And the Democrats have kind of gotten, I think, a little too thinking that things were only going to get better, and that there was no way we could go 2 steps back. Or whatever. And so I think the Democrats need to take this opportunity and realize, like, hey, it's a 2-party system, but the parties are made up of who shows up. Yeah. And that's why I'm showing up, because I'm like, I want to make sure the party's made up of people with my ideas and with my understanding. And that's what I think too many people are cynical, and they need to, like, realize, hey, it's super easy to sit in your house smoking weed, drinking beers, saying everything sucks. That's wicked easy. That's the easiest thing you can do, to show up and get involved in the party. I mean, I go to these meetings and it's all people over the age of 60, and I get it. It's boring, and they need to, fix that and help bring young people. And that's why I'm doing so much social media, just to bring young people into these ideas.
Right.
But young people got to give back. You got to show up and vote, and you got to show up, for whatever kind of events you can that you see happening, and sort of change the narrative.
Yeah. Well, I love everything you just said.
Yeah, me too. That was good.
Say it again. People are too cynical. That's what we're about.
And I mean, it goes both ways. Like, I totally understand the cynicism. It's completely warranted. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's completely justified, and I'm not like at all saying people shouldn't be cynical. Yeah. But I think you got to like take your cynicism and your sort of anger at the world and channel it in a productive way, as opposed to like channeling it into
checking out.
Yeah, right. Checking out. Like, you can't use sort of the Trump years as a reason to stop watching the news and not be involved. Like, we need you now more than ever.
Yeah. Like, sometimes you run into people and what they want is to just, I just want to move to the woods. I want to be left alone. I don't want I don't want to feel accountable
Yeah.
to anybody, and like respectfully, you're here, you were born, and you're here because of the people who came before you.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people across human history, especially in the United States even, right, who they have just worked so hard to give us, the right to vote, the right to participate, the right to say whatever we want and not be punished for it. We're all indebted to the people who came before us. Let's try and engage in good faith on solving problems.
And I think the key is finding the things we agree on and not focusing on the things that we disagree on, because that's just been the sort of, it's so easy to just play the outrage game, you know, and the offended game and be offended by people and hold them to this standard that they can never get to. I mean, it's just really easier to get very holier than thou with the social justice warrior sort of attitude. You know? And the reality is, like, most people, I think, are trying to be good people. Yeah. You know what I mean? And we're all trying. And it's just very easy to be offended if you want to be. Yeah. And it's much easier to just assume everyone's coming from a good place.
And like you said, there are endless reasons all the time, everywhere, to be cynical, to not care, to be checked out, right? Like, it's endless. It's endless. And I think I see you as part of this movement of like reasons to kind of reject that, right? Yeah. Of like, man, we have all these gifts, we have all these opportunities, you maybe never imagined like as a restaurateur and a New Hampshireite that you'd be in this position, but like here you are, because it's, people are always so cynical about our public servants. And like, I feel like you're trying to go about this as transparently as a human possibly could. Yeah. And even if people don't agree with like everything you say, what's not to like about, I'm just out here trying, where I'm participating. What are you doing?
Yeah. Well, that's it. And I mean, if somebody sees me running for governor and says, hey, that guy's running for governor, I'm only 25, but I could run for town council or school board. Like, that's kind of what I'm trying to inspire people to do as well. It's like, there's so many ways to get involved, and we've had such a decline in public engagement, over the last few years. People are just they're not coaching sports teams. They're not getting part of clubs. They're not joining, different, Elks lodges and stuff the way that they were 20 or 30 years ago. And it's just really starting to impact our society because we're just not communicating with people of different socioeconomic backgrounds or different racial backgrounds or different housing backgrounds. Yeah. I think of people that lived in the houses realize what it's like to have your rent go from 1,000 to 1,600 in 2 or 3 years. They go, holy shit, we need to build more apartments. You know? And I feel like that is really it. It's just being willing to talk to people that are outside of your sort of circle, is so crucial.
You might even like it. You learn something. You might even enjoy yourself. Yeah. Get out of your comfort zone. Thanks for coming on the show.
VoteKuiper.org if you want to learn more about my campaign.
Thanks, John.
No worries.
Hey there. Thanks for spending some time with us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can learn more about today's guest and how to get involved with or support their work in the show notes. If you'd like to suggest a guest for the show or have any story tips for our Good News in New Hampshire newsletter, shoot me a message at hello@granitegoodness.com. Music for this episode was provided by the band Sneaky Miles, who hail from Newmarket, New Hampshire. Recording space was provided by Treeline Outfitters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Until next time, I'm the creator of Granite Goodness and the host of the Granite Goodness podcast, Andy DeMeo. Thanks for listening.